Coming up on today's show, Bree Mills is an award-winning adult film director, writer, and producer. She is head of Gamma Films Group and chief creative officer for Adult Time, a leading streaming platform for adult audiences. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Shambliss. Welcome back to Loving Without Boundaries, where I'm really excited to have what I think is going to be a fascinating and really interesting conversation here with Bree Mills, who is the Chief Creative Officer for Adult Time, among many other exciting things that I'm sure we're going to talk about today. So thank you for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with me.
No, it's my pleasure, Kitty. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'd love it if you would just introduce yourself in your own words to our listeners so they can get to know you a little bit better before we dive in.
Sure. Well, I like to refer to myself as a lousy pornographer who somehow ended up being the head of one of the largest streaming platforms in the adult space. But I am the chief creative officer for Adult Time. We're sort of like the Netflix of porn. That's how we've most commonly been described. The reason I call myself a lousy pornographer is that I come from like a mainstream marketing, communication, and arts background. I've always had a appreciation for media and pop culture and film, and somehow through kind of like luck and happenstance, I ended up in the adult space with an open mind and the opportunity to start producing content. And I took it as a challenge and discovered that I really loved creating films within the medium of sex and sexuality, because as subject matter, you can never run out of things to say when it comes to sex and sexuality. So I've never been motivated from kind of what might be the stereotypical perception of what motivates an adult filmmaker, right? So, sex is great. I love it. Everybody should have their own positive relationship with it. But it's a great excuse for me to make movies and to do character development and to create these universes. And that's like my motivation. So I work with amazing professionals. So if I do my job, I help, set up these really great sex scenes that then, can be there for traditional audiences while I'm secretly just being a passionate artist on my end.
That's a beautiful, amazing description, very passionate as well. And I'm definitely curious to dive into what that looks like. I'm very curious, partly because my first career was a graphic designer who worked my way up to art director and eventually creative director at an advertising agency and at design firms. So I've been in that world, of course, in a completely different way of being the creative director. So I'm super excited to talk more about that. But if it's okay with you, I'd love to go back in time a little bit to get to know you and your background a little bit better. And one way I like to walk into that is to ask you, was there either a moment in time or a series of moments in time where you knew that maybe you were just a little bit different? Like you weren't going to maybe be fitting that kind of traditional heteronormative monogamous, whatever you want to call it, kind of straight and narrow or relationship escalator, whatever that looks like to you. And you were maybe just going to not quite fit that cookie cutter mold. Was there a moment or a series of events that happened?
Sure. Well, let me see. So I grew up, I was born in the States, but I grew up in Canada. So I definitely consider myself more to be kind of Canadian in how I was raised. I was raised in a mid-sized Canadian city southwest of Toronto, pretty conservative, quite homogenous. It was a university city, and my father's was a university professor. So, I had a lot of influences from him, and he came out when I was 8. And when my parents divorced, we lived with my father. So at that time, this was like the late 80s. At that time, you were barely hearing about families with divorced parents, let alone, gay parents and being raised in a same-sex household. And my father, being, an academic, ended up fusing a lot of his professional work with his, personal advocacy and personal identity. So he ended up founding the first gay and lesbian research institute in North America.
Wow.
A place called the Pride Library at Western University. And that became like a huge driver for him. And, he's a larger than life character. So he had a lot of influence on me. Definitely. I see a lot of myself in him. And so, we were raised with a lot of awareness about, the spectrum of sexuality and about free speech and about, literature and arts and culture. And, so I had all of that as, my main source of influence growing up. Definitely shaped a lot of the way that I viewed the world and how I approached things. And I'm somebody who is, when I'm interested in something, I'm very ambitious and I'll excel at it. If I'm not interested in it, forget it, but if I was interested, if I'm micro-focused on it, I'm going to do all the things. And so I ended up, I've always been that way, whether it was in, athletics growing up, or I did a lot of theater growing up that I was very passionate about. And when I became a young adult, I ended up, this was again, early days of the internet, early days of e-commerce. So for me, it kind of made sense to get into, the world of online marketing. And I've been always really interested in consumer behavior and what kind of motivates people to do certain things. And I think the moment where, I don't know, when I look back on it now, especially with how my career has evolved, when I was in my early 20s, I was, just working at a secondhand bookstore while I was going to school. And it was one of those buy and sell type of, mom and pop shops. And they had acquired a book collection from an elderly gentleman. And part of that book collection was this pristine vintage erotica collection. Like every magazine, with the exception of the first issue of Playboy, but all the copycat kind of cheesecake magazines and girly magazines, as they called them, that came out in the 50s and the 60s, through to, a lot of the banned paperback books. And anyway, this old man had this treasure trove of vintage erotica. Wow. Yeah. And, we were kind of like a counterculture shop. So we were like, oh, that's cool. Like, we'll buy it. Didn't really realize that what we were buying had a lot of quite valuable memorabilia in it. And because I was like the young, savvy staff member, like, well, I'll put this up on eBay and I'll like sell it on eBay. And that was really when I discovered one, the real psychological drivers of people's desire, because, a lot of those magazines had articles and pictorials. And what I would do is I would go through them and I would just itemize everything. If there was a pictorial on girls in Argyle sweaters, I would list it. If there was underwater photography, I would list it. And then I discovered all of these people were out on the internet hunting down very specific micro fetishes. And I'm, I can't, despite having like a somewhat, we'll call it open-minded, eccentric father, I was pretty vanilla, in terms of my own, I was definitely gay. There was no doubt about it from, the day I was born, but I was sort of quite, somewhat even conservative, but I was fascinated by, man, like what motivates somebody to seek out shots of girls playing musical instruments, and it really led me to understand, like, wow, sexuality, especially when it comes to like fetish and like what you consume, is something that is so deeply rooted in every human being, but can really get to a point where you're scouring the internet looking for such specific things. And so, again, that was my early 20s. I did that for a couple of years. I ended up importing other erotica collections. Just I got kind of good at selling the stuff. And I left that job. I went and worked in, mainstream kind of entertainment marketing for a while. But when I got back to the world of adult, which happened it was very much by coincidence. I was headhunted by the company that I'm still with now because they were looking for an English speaking marketing person. They were based in Montreal in Quebec in Canada.
Oh, wow.
And this was, right around, I think, the 2008 financial collapse. So I'm like, well, porn seems kind of recession proof and I'm open-minded, right? I never really watched porn, like porn to me was like what you rented at the video store or under your brother's bed. I was not super well versed in it except for this vintage erotica I had sold.
Wow.
And when I kind of got back or got into the company at the time was the web technology partner to a lot of existing popular porn studios and performers. So like we didn't make the content, we just like would run the websites. But we ran the websites for, some pretty big names, pretty successful studios and performers in the industry. And so I got like this crash course in, again, all this different kind of content because, we manage gay sites, straight sites, fetish sites, vanilla sites. And it was like seeing what people not only would pay to watch, because that's not the same as just what anybody could find on Pornhub, right? Like what motivates somebody to join a site and to pay a subscription fee and to be a fan. And then also like just seeing what about each of these brands ticked the boxes for their fan base. And it was sort of the same thing as going back and gutting those magazines. It was like the understanding the micro desires that like fuel somebody to want to join a site. And that, so when we decided as a company, hey, maybe we should try making our own stuff. I was like, I like movies.
Yeah.
I'm creative. I'll try it. Never been on a film set before. I'd never really worked with anybody actually in the production side of the business. But I threw myself in and like, it's like 10 years later and, we've built a huge studio brands and Adult Timer brand. And I've been blessed to have been, an award director and producer and writer.
Wow.
Here I am. So
that's incredible.
Magazines.
That's incredible. What an amazing, amazing story. And I love how you just kind of like took us on a journey there that makes a lot of sense given your background. And so I'd love to, if I could though, put a little bit of a pin in that because what I find fascinating, you may have seen I've done like 250 podcast episodes, so I've interviewed a lot of people. And what I'm really picking up from you is just this sense of ease and grace and you just kind of dropped in there like, yeah, I've been gay since the day I was born and I'm vanilla. Like, and so if I could, I'd love to kind of go back to that a little bit because even in my own life, I kid you not, just literally within 24 hours, I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine who didn't come out as gay till he was in his mid-30s. And I have another dear friend who didn't come out as gay till I want to say his early 30s. And some of those folks I found have struggled off and on with depression and trying to accept who they are. And they didn't have the background that you had where you were growing up in a household where your father came out as 8, right? And everything that you described. So if it's okay, I think it would be really helpful for a lot of people out there to hear from that perspective, if you wouldn't mind sharing of like when you were growing up, like how did you know at such a young age that you were gay? And I'd love to, well, I'll go after that. I don't want to ask too many questions all at one time because I think that will help a lot of people.
Yeah, well, so and it's not to say that there wasn't. I mean, there's the phrase "homophobia starts at home," right? Which is we as a society, even though it's so much progress has happened even in my own lifetime, but it really does. It's deeply ingrained and internalized. So the question being gay from the day I was born, so it was never a question. Like by the time I started to I would not have understood to put a label on it, but from the time I started to have feelings of, you know, like early feelings of sexuality, and it's certainly about like sexual identity. Because I think there's a real difference, and I talk about this a lot in a couple of different series I do. But there's a difference between like sexuality and sexual identity, and I think like you begin even in childhood to develop what ultimately becomes a sexual identity, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything sexual or, you know, exhibiting sexuality, but you know, probably 5 or 6, like it's like my early memories, where it was more like kind of like, do I see myself? It very influenced by pop culture, right? Like, what do I see happening on the TV shows I'm watching? And I would always see, you know, a guy taking a girl to the malt shop, or like, you know, very kind of heteronormative, very traditional images. And like, I wanted to be the one taking giving the girl my letter jacket. Like, I very much identified with that.
I see.
From as early as I can remember. I only learned about what gay was when my dad came out. So my dad came out when I was 8. And I remember that prior to that, no idea what that meant. And it never entered my vernacular. It was never talked about on the schoolyards. But after my dad came out and, you know, I learned roughly what that meant, then, you know, I started to hear about it on the schoolyard and like, you know, have to kind of deal with the negative social repercussions of it. So you have to remember too, this was like 1989, 88, 89, early 90s. So I actually made a movie a number of years ago called Teenage Lesbian that is available. I made an R-rated version of it that is available for anybody to watch. It was about my time being a gay teenager in the half of the 90s, because you can't tell a story about that without talking about sexuality. That's, again, one of the things I try to challenge with my work is like, just because it's an adult film doesn't mean it's not a film. We just don't have to deal with the same censorship as somebody would, you know, in their film. So, you know, but I got bullied. I was thrown into a dumpster when I was 14.
Oh, wow.
I never tried to really fake being straight because, I mean, let's face it, I wasn't very good. It wasn't a very convincing lie. You know, as I entered puberty, I had a couple of failed, and I was like, you know, I'm gonna grow my hair out for about 5 minutes, and you know, I don't want to do that. I confused a lot of gender identity and sexuality when I was young. Like, I definitely remember as a early teenager, well, I mean, really into my 20s, kind of having feelings of, you know, was I born in the wrong body? Am I really a boy? Because I identified with seeing boys taking girls out, and that I wanted to be those boys. I ultimately realized, you know, as I became an adult and as I became more comfortable with myself, that no, I don't actually want to be a boy. I just wanted to have the dynamic that I was seeing, because you didn't have any other dynamics at that point, you know? So yeah, there definitely was, like, I was very lucky in the sense that I was enough of just being a unique character that, you know, it was me and one boy. We were the gay girl and the gay boy in our high school.
Wow.
Everybody knew it wasn't, we weren't, you know, we were not shunned. We had a big group of, all our friends were kind of straight. We were sort of the token gays in the group. And we were somewhat assimilated otherwise. So, I mean, I was very fortunate that for the most part, you know, I was able to like be myself and that be accepted by, again, even in the somewhat conservative, homogenous community. So, you know, and in part, I think it was because my dad was pretty well known. He was one to the court attention. So he kind of, he couldn't kind of avoid it because he was, you know, kind of putting the billboards up. So
right.
I kind of, you know, everybody somewhat knew who I was, knew who my family was, and you know, it was more or less okay. But yeah, I mean, that was sort of, I guess, a more detailed description of my adolescence and what.
Yeah. Oh, this is so incredibly helpful, and I want to appreciate. I really want to appreciate your vulnerability and sharing all that, including thank you for telling about that movie Teenage Lesbian, because that's something I would love to check out as well, and I'm sure some of the listeners would. And thank you for creating it. And I talk with people from all different generations and ages, so it's interesting to hear it from your perspective of that was the late 80s, and early 90s for you. So.
Well, it's crazy because I work with all these people that are in their, early 20s now. And I'll talk about the Ellen coming out episode because, I remember sneaking into there was one community center, like LGBTQ community center, and you had to sneak in the back door because if you got caught going through the front door, like you could get beaten up, right? So you had to sneaking into that when I was about 15 or 16 to watch in a crowded room the Ellen coming out episode because it was history. And, now, 30 years later, I'll reference that to somebody I'm working with and they're like, what? They made the doctor, It's kind of part of my motivation to make Teenage Lesbian, where I basically took all of my real life memories and experiences and I just fictionalized into somebody's 18th year. Of course, we're going to only be talking about anything that happens, once you're of legal age within adult content. So it was just sort of dramatized within the context of somebody's 18th year. But I wanted to put it out there because, it's a reminder that like not too long ago, things were really different. And, so it's a good testament to how far we've come, but also like the importance of progress.
Exactly. And that's partly why I do the work that I do. This is my second career, as I kind of implied, and it's partly because I want to serve the wider community of those who are in the LGBTQ plus, who identify as wanting either polyamory or open relationships, like anything outside of heteronormative monogamy, and give them a safe place to have conversations, to feel safe. And so I really appreciate everything that you shared there. I'd love to, I have definitely a few questions, but one is, since you did have to go through, you mentioned being thrown in the dumpster at 14 and things of that nature. What were some of the ways that, whether it was the way that you thought about it or the support system of your father, like what are some ways that you navigated some of the stigma that you experienced when you were growing up?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, I think that, even though that sounds like an extreme example, that definitely would be like my most extreme example. Mm. There were more positives than there were negatives. So, and I feel very blessed about that because I know that is not a lot of people's experience. How did I navigate it? It's funny. A lot of it was the power of assimilation, which is not necessarily the best answer. At the time, this was like the don't ask, don't tell years, right? So at the time, again, nobody was surprised. I think I kind of officially came out by the time I was 15 or 16, but it was very anticlimactic. Most people are like, yeah, we know, but like I said, I was the token gay in amongst, a group of sort of straight identifying peers. And it was just kind of like, we didn't make a thing of it. It was just me being me. And, when we were at a party and so-and-so had a crush on this girl, or I would have a crush on this girl, or like, it was just sort of like, I treated it very normally and my friends also did. And being able to just kind of exist as a person who happened to be gay, that was always the way that I chose to approach it. Because it's actually how I feel. And maybe it's like because my father was such an advocate, maybe it was a bit of like a instinctual defiance to like, and I recognize the importance of being out and proud. And I'm so grateful to all those who really struggled because of the privilege that in order for me to have the privilege that I've had. But my instinct was always just to be, someone that you can meet and get to know to help break misconceptions. So, I think I dealt with it by trying never to make it more of my identity than just my already over the top manic personalities. So it's kind of like, oh, that's just Bree, you know, like that's just who I am. And yeah, that happens to be a part of it.
Right, right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think it's powerful just to hear your story and just notice that, yeah, everyone is coming from a different set of cloth. You know, I always love that kind of nurture versus nature. But I think some of it can also, like, I love that you brought up the word instincts. Like, for example, like you, I've been always a type of person who's been very motivated by achievements and career and like digging my teeth in when I really find something interesting. And I think it can be the same maybe for confidence or security inside of oneself, because you just kind of, even in your story, you sound like just kind of like a relatively natural, confident person, and kind of like drawing from that self-motivation. And maybe not everybody, you know, some of that might have been from your father and coming to that from that place, but some of it could just be like part of who you are. But yeah, I see other people sometimes who they may just feel deeply insecure, and it could be partly because of the environment that they're in or something inside themselves. So that's why I wanted to tease that out a little bit. But either way, it's inspiring no matter what, to just hear how you kind of handled it, and that you did have some of those things that were stacked in your favor. But I also hear just a lot of internal confidence and being also in an environment where you were accepted, but you may have partly been accepted because you accepted yourself. You know?
Yeah. I've never had any short of confidence.
That's awesome.
Sometimes that means I'm like Icarus who flies too close to the sun and I need to go back and retreat. But I've never been one who hasn't been outspoken in the things that I, you know, again, feel passionate about.
So. That's awesome. That's awesome. And also you're clearly sex positive. And just before we kind of move on, like in terms of, you mentioned before vanilla, does that mean also in terms of, do you tend to be more monogamous in nature? Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I'm like the classic, you know, U-Haul lesbian, serial monogamous stereotype. No, and I'm happily married. My wife and I have been married. We've been together. We're coming up on our 7th wedding anniversary. And, you know, again, it's cool because I get to work with so many different people given the work that I do, and see all walks of life from everyone on the identity spectrum and the sexuality spectrum. And so I meet a lot of amazing folks that are, you know, into polyamory, and I myself am, you know, it's funny. I've come to realize from being in the sex industry, you know, that definitely there is a difference between the physical act of sex, especially sex as performance, and intimacy. Not the same thing. For me, though, sex is deeply, it has always been deeply tied to an emotional connection and I have had, I think, 2 one-night stands in my life, and they happened over the same weekend, and it was too overwhelming. You know, like I am pretty like, you know, if we're gonna be intimate, it's because I want a relationship or something. So it's just the way I'm hardwired, and you know, and again, that's fine. It's clearly a spectrum, and everybody
exactly. Yeah. We I like to think of words as tools, not necessarily labels. But yeah, like the difference between being polysexual versus, you know, demisexual and all that. So that's I really appreciate just the way you described all that. So and explaining where you are today. That's awesome. So I'd love to get back to where you are now career-wise. And I love how you were talking about how you love to dig into what motivates somebody to join a paid site. And so with all of the incredible work that you've been doing, what are some of the things that you've gleaned about that in terms of human nature and who might be the person who would pay for a subscription versus look for, say, because that's what I'm currently doing, is we look for the free paid, the free porn sites. And I was looking at the Adult Time site. It looks very professional, very beautiful. So I can see all the hard work that you and your team have put into that. And lots of really cool categories.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'd love to maybe just hear some under the hood, what you've learned.
Well, it's been an evolution. It's a learning process.
Mm.
You know, traditionally the adult, let's say like, you know, online video content, there's two main ways you can access it.
Mm-hmm.
There are free sites like Pornhub is probably the most recognized, where, you know, really, if you just want to get off on a Friday night, like there's, you know, you can find pretty much anything on there, and, you know, that's, and they make their money via advertising. So getting a lot of traffic is, you know, what helps them be able to push those crazy ads and make money. For us, we are not at all in the free site space. We're in the subscription based like arena. So all of our content is intended, of course, for, you know, to be accessed by, you know, adults that have been verified, that have paid a subscription. And as you notice when you go on Adult Time, it's, even though we're proud of the fact that we're making adult content, you know, porn done differently, that's our mantra, and we're proud of it. We're also proud of the fact that since we launched, we've always been safe for work before the paywall. And that, you know, what we offer is for paying adult subscribers. So, what's cool is that and this was sort of my vision originally for creating the platform, is as a creative, I wanted a space where I could kind of be free to try anything within, you know, obviously we also maintain very strict guidelines on what we produce and don't produce, but within those guidelines, the freedom to be creative, right? So, you know, and also to understand that just because, you know, that people like what they like, for sure. Like, you usually have a primary thing that you like. But a lot of people also are curious, and even though they might not have bought in for that niche, if it's available for them to check out, especially in a safe, inclusive space, one thing that we've seen is that you're going to get the people that'll join for one series. And we have within the platform, again, much like a Netflix, you have a lot of different channels. I think we've got over 400 channels at this point. And it's channels are our original studios, which basically produce like, you know, like regular shows and recurring themes. We have a lot of other well-known adult brands that have what we call channel partnerships that also are showing some of their content in the platform. And then we can kind of drop anything, right? So we can do films, we can do limited releases. I've done docuseries, we've done podcasts, you know, you can really do anything. So giving people the ability to choose what they want to watch, which is what we do, it means that you might have somebody who comes in for one series and ends up going and watching something completely different because they can. And you know, we call that kind of crossover interest. And there's definitely crossover interest between certain genres more than others. But it's kind of fascinating when you catch something that appeals to more than one group. And probably the best example I can give of that would be content that features trans women. So, you know, we have a number of beautiful, amazing series that are really built to showcase trans women in non-fetishizing, really for like the goddesses that they are. And that series is very popular. There's people that buy in just to primarily watch that series. But the number of people who have been devoted cis lesbian porn fans that come over and watch our trans cis lesbian stories that we have on that series, you can see they would never have probably bought a quote unquote trans porn site, but they having the opportunity to explore that in a safe, non-judgmental way, it's now become one of their favorite series. And I see we've been doing a lot of kind of gender bending content in the last couple of years. And we found that it's really courts like the same audience. So we have a femboy series We have a Futanari series, which is an interesting kind of niche, inspired by hentai. And we have obviously trans content, and it's all kind of the same people that are watching all of it. And the unifying factor is the fact that it kind of plays on the non-traditional gender spectrum. And I find that kind of interesting. So it's cool to be able to see, you know, you want to make a hit show like any other platform, right? Like I want to make a hit show that people are going to watch so we can make more hit shows. But it's even cooler when you can make a hit show and it targets one audience, but then you can see the interest kind of come from some of our other non-targeted audience groups. And then you've really got something. So it's a fun place for a creative like me to play.
I was going to say, I mean, I actually really love my job because partly my job is I get to talk to people like you, right? But I'm also like in love with how your job sounds. It sounds just absolutely incredible.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it is. Listen, I have a dream job. I can't complain.
Yeah, it's totally amazing. So, and when you say shows, like they're literally like shows where there's like a running story, like that is fascinating.
Yeah, we have we've got we really try to approach it no different from a mainstream streaming platform in the sense that there's series that are vignettes where each episode is kind of a different story, but within the same theme. We have recurring stories. We have, feature films. We have, one-off. We just did this series called The Bottom Floor, which is basically like a sex party that we threw and filmed. That was like kind of a whole spectrum of sexuality, sex party. We do all kinds of things.
That's incredible. So as the chief creative officer, it sounds like you're kind of the head honcho in that regard, and you have other directors and writers and producers under you as well.
Yeah, oh, definitely. So
okay.
Adult Time itself, I'm kind of at this point like the mascot. We've got an amazing team. We have over 50 people that are just a dedicated in-house team. This includes writers, editors, marketing and sales staff, obviously our platform team and all of our developers for the actual technology behind what we do. So the whole organization itself. And then we have, at this point, 5 or 6 what we call core crews who are our main producing teams that are filming the breadth of the content we make. And we also bring in, sort of special one-off producers to do different projects. And I am very, very well supported by a great operational team. And, I get to be the one that shouts from the top of the mountain crazy ideas of what we should
oh my gosh.
And just kind of just disrupt everything. That's my job.
So do you have main offices and also like where the main studios are that you create all of this from?
Yeah, so we do have offices. Our company is based in Montreal, so we have office there. Of course, in the remote work world, we're one of those fully remote companies too. So we have staff and team members, all over, mostly North America. We primarily film in Los Angeles, so most of our crews, which are all independent production companies on their own right, we're based here. That's where I'm based. And then we have, we don't have a proprietary studio that we film out of. We have a network of, locations and studios that we regularly will book and use for projects.
That's fascinating. And coming from my, I know I'm older than you. I'm in my mid-50s. And when I kind of went into my art journey with the creative director, it was back in the old days where we would actually storyboard things with a pencil on paper. Yep. So I'm curious, when you all are coming up with creative ideas for these stories, is that still any type of practice, or is it all digital because it's also fascinating to think of it in terms of, adult, Netflix for, that kind of thing, in terms of how you come up with the ideas and share them with each other when you're coming up with a concept.
So we definitely employ, a few different tactics in pre-production, and it does depend too on what the project is. Mm-hmm. So for myself, if it's a project that I'm going to be directly producing or creating, I do I do like to storyboard a certain degree. I certainly spend a lot. I try to take my time in pre-production and at least have a lot of. I myself do not do dialogue scripts. That's kind of part of my style as a director. Is I do all improvised acting with the actors that I'm working with. But I do very detailed story treatments and storyboards and shot lists, and so that's the just the way I approach stuff. We do have, we have a whole writer's room. They have multiple weekly brainstorms. So there's a lot of like just idea generation. We're huge on collaborating with other members of our community and our audience too. So we're like regularly crowdsourcing story ideas and developing those both from like performers that have a story they want to tell, and sometimes, fans as well. And we've been, like the rest of the world, we're also adopting AI where we can. So,
wow,
one of my staff, whenever we're coming up with, I myself, I always think in terms of the poster. That's just as a creative. Once we've got an idea, the first thing I think of is like, what does the movie poster look like, right? And so she will then go and generate, concepts based on the specs I gave her. So we'll use that actually for a lot, kind of almost in lieu of storyboarding these days because it's such a powerful tool. So
wow, so we'll fascinating.
You get kind of weird results. Sometimes kind of just horrifying results.
Right. Oh, that's funny. That's funny.
Testicles in places that you shouldn't have testicles that you didn't ask for, but they just came out and
oh my God.
AI rendering, but yeah, we use a bunch of different tools.
That's incredible. You just sound like you have the most amazing and fascinating and completely sex positive and potentially hilarious job. And you must have a lot of fun. You would, I imagine, all the people that you work with as well.
Yeah. The conversations that we have in our, Slacks and our Zoom meetings are very normal to us.
Right.
So probably very shocking to the rest of the world.
Well, even in the context of the work that I do here with Living Without Boundaries, and I live with my two partners, so my husband and my other partner as well, who was a cisgendered male, and they have other partners. So we often joke around that in our lifestyle, the conversations are half the fun. We keep saying we need to make a T-shirt that says that. And for those who, of course, can't see our video, I love your shirt that says "Practice Safe Sets." That's SETS. So
yeah,
I love that. So, and just a few more questions, and then we'll start to wrap it up. Which would be, what would you say is your, like, how would you describe your kind of target audience? Like, who would you say Adult Time is for?
Yeah. So Adult Time is is an all-inclusive platform in the sense that within, when you join as a subscriber, you do have access to the entire collection, and that has content for all the main sexual preferences in terms of different sexual orientations and gender pairing combinations. So, like, officially, we are, we are definitely available for anybody who wants to come in to watch our content. When it comes to, the demographic of who pays for adult content primarily, it is definitely still primarily a, cis male identifying audience. So while, we are open and embrace all, and we certainly have a good number of like couples and, female identifying folks, it is primarily, we're primarily doing it for the boys still.
That's interesting. And especially considering that you're at the helm of the creative part of it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They have to deal with me. They do.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And before we maybe start to wrap it up, is there any question I haven't asked you or any message you would like to give our audience and our listeners?
No, I think just, if I've learned anything from the work that I do, there's two main takeaways that I would share. For those who might not be as well versed with adult content, right? Like, let's say you were like me when I started my career in adult, where porn was sort of, again, this thing at the back of the video store, like you didn't, the guy with the trench coat in an alleyway, right? Here's the reality. The reality is that the industry is not an evil, horrible, exploitative industry. Like any industry, particularly in entertainment, you're going to have your good actors and your bad actors, but the community of people that are producing content, it's really not that big. And, some of the most intelligent, open, compassionate, kind, caring human beings I've ever met have been within this industry. We kind of call ourselves the island of misfit toys because, there's so much stigma, that we face as a community from people who just don't understand, one, that we're human beings, two, that we can actually be somewhat normal, quote unquote, well-adjusted human beings, that we're parents. I have, 2 kids. I am one of so many people that are parents that are, successful, healthy parents in relationships and everything. So just to kind of remember to humanize, especially when you're checking out Pornhub on a Friday night, remember there's humans that made that content. And the best way you can support, of course, the best way you can support us is to not watch it for free and support us. But at the very least, just remember that we're people and that we should be respected and that you're getting off to these people. So remember that, there's a certain amount of when we're worried about exploitation, right? Mm-hmm. Remember that we're people because we're not disposable. So I think that's a really important takeaway. The amount of abuse that adult performers in particular suffer online from anonymous trolls, like, come on, like that's where we should be pointing our finger more than anything, right? So it's really important to remember not just the human beings behind the work, but like the really good human beings behind the work, and that it's a job like anything else, It's just a kind of a funny one.
Yeah.
And also that, it's really made me appreciate the importance of just talking about sex and sexuality, because when you look at society and you look at all of the hang-ups and the deep mental health issues and suicide and depression and self-harm and body image issues and all of these things that really exist and are so exasperated by digital culture, it all connects back to that founding of identity. And, for whatever reason, even though sex and sexuality are so fundamentally important to all of us. I mean, we are all who we are because in large part, we are sexual beings, even if we're asexual, that's still a sexual identity. And we just don't talk about it. And then, anytime you try to explore it, it just gets put in a box and gets labeled. And I've been very frustrated by that as a filmmaker because the amount of censorship, I've tried to have my films, again, films that I intentionally cut at the exact same standards as an R-rated film, but I can't even get them submitted because the fact that my company has the word adult in it. And meanwhile, you see on these, top reality shows that, people are being fed drinks and clearly being pushed into corners and, but actually trying to explore important subjects about sex and sexuality without censoring the sex and sexuality. Oh, that gets labeled and shoved into a box. So I think again, I see our work as a porn community as a great opportunity for people who are not afraid to express themselves to actually do good and provide some insight. I have a podcast as well that it's just about talking to the people I work with, not about, does dick size matter and these other questions, but actually their experience because they're not afraid to talk about it. And I hope that, us and podcasts such as yourself and, and just collectively we can start to chip away at the idea that not talking about sex is helping us because it's really hurting us and it's just going to keep compounding.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's you're speaking to the special place in my heart, which is exactly why I created my mission over here and this podcast so that we can talk about sex, and we talked before we started recording that for reasons because of the world that we live in, sometimes we need to operate under a pseudonym just for protection. And I wish we didn't live in a world where we had to do that, but we do, you know. So, but I partly do. I do that also so that I can speak freely, as you know, and as safely as I possibly can, and have amazing people such as yourself come on the podcast. So I just want to thank you again for being here, for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Where can people find you, and of course the work that we've been talking about?
Awesome. Well, the best way to see what I'm all about is to visit adulttime.com. You could also check out Adult Time on social. We're on X at adulttimecom, at Instagram at adulttimehq, and TikTok, where we have a hilarious TikTok account at Corn, CORN, up close. And you can find me on all my socials at the Bree Mills.
That was awesome. So TikTok was Corn Up Close.
Yes.
And IG was Adult Time EQ?
HQ.
Oh, HQ. I got it for headquarters. Got it. Okay. Cool. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And I plan to check out more myself, and I appreciate your time. So I really loved everything that you shared and how candid and vulnerable you were as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Kitty. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply, and book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes, and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships, while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chambliss, and let's talk soon.